Waco, Texas, 1993. The Branch Davidian compound. It had been besieged by the FBI and other law enforcement agencies for quite some time. People had gathered from all over the world because it had become quite the media sensation. A number of these people were suspicious of the government. They felt the government was overreaching by besieging these citizens inside the cult compound. There was one young man who was there in this group of people who had come to watch, who was firmly convinced that the U.S. government was actively engaged in warfare against its own citizens. He believed that the Waco siege was another example of this. He was someone who took his beliefs really far. He was constantly writing letters to the government, to the FBI in particular, even sending threats to individual FBI agents by name, including the sniper who had killed the wife of Randy Weaver at Ruby Ridge. This young man honestly felt himself to be a soldier in an active shooting war between the United States government and its people. He was active on the gun show circuit. He would often travel to gun shows in order to meet and associate with other people who shared his same belief system. He actually quit the NRA because he felt they were too soft on gun rights. He went into business with a friend of his, selling ammonium nitrate, a component of a homemade explosive. They were selling it to other people who believed as they did, who needed to supposedly defend themselves against the government. Then one day in 1995, he took a rental truck and he filled it full of this ammonium nitrate and diesel fuel, making a very powerful explosive. Now, if you've seen video of some of these roadside bombs in the Middle East conflict over the years, you've seen some explosions that were pretty big, some of them pretty dramatic. This was nothing like those. This put them all to shame. This was not a car trunk filled with explosives. This was an entire truck. The shattering detonation that this created damaged 300 buildings in Oklahoma City. This young man's name was Timothy McVeigh, and by the end of the day, he'd killed 168 people at the federal building in Oklahoma City, including 19 children, which, strangely enough, makes him only the second worst mass murderer of children in U.S. history. Why did this happen? Well, it happened because he had a belief system that he failed to challenge. He had a belief system that was in line with his worldview, so he was happy with it. He only sought information that confirmed his beliefs. He never sought information that challenged his beliefs. Well, you're not going to get very far if you just assume that everything you believe is true and will hear nothing to the contrary. That's what Timothy McVeigh did. Now, we're going to come back to him a little bit later, but as you've seen, the title of this talk is We Are All Conspiracy Theorists. Well, does that mean I'm saying we're all like Timothy McVeigh? Well, stick around, let's find out. My name is Brian Dunning. I'm a science writer, a member of the National Association of Science Writers, and I'm probably best known for my podcast, Skeptoid, which has been in the top 10 of iTunes social sciences for about 12 years straight now. I do a lot of stories on urban legends, including conspiracy theories. I'm also the author of the 2018 book, Conspiracies Declassified from Simon & Schuster, available wherever books are sold. It's a deep dive into 50 of the most popular conspiracy theories. Any conspiracy theory you've heard of is probably one of the ones in this book. So I know my stuff when it comes to conspiracy theories. That's what I do for a living. I deal with conspiracy theories all day long, every day. I deal with people who believe them, who email me, who send me death threats. I deal with people who are seeking help trying to debunk them or trying to get a friend to move away from conspiratorial beliefs. And speaking of death threats, everyone who is a science writer, myself and all of my colleagues, we all get this. If you ever pick up a science magazine or you look at a science news website, The author of that article gets death threats just by being a science writer, because conspiratorial beliefs are so widespread in this world. There's virtually nothing you can say that somebody doesn't charge you with being a shill for big oil, big pharma, big agriculture, big chemical, big toxins, whatever it is, big UFOs, big Bigfoot. I get that. I've been charged with being paid to cover up Bigfoot. I almost said that I'm being paid to cover up Bigfoot. I wish. I don't know who signs that check. But we all get this. It's important to understand that the science perspective is one that is controversial for some reason. And part of the reason for that is the tendency of these conspiratorial beliefs to be so widespread. So this talk is called We Are All Conspiracy Theorists, and I'm going to go into detail on why I believe that we're all conspiratorial to some degree. So who is this talk for? It's for you, obviously, since you're here. It's for anyone who cares to hear what I have to say on the subject of conspiracy theories. A lot of you are people who have a friend, a family member, a coworker, etc., who has some strange beliefs, and you're hoping to find some nugget you can use to help draw them away from that and bring them back into reality. This talk is also, though, for people who believe that I am a paid shill for the government, for the aliens, whatever it is. If you believe that I am lying in everything that I say and everything that I write because I'm being paid to lie about it, then this is a talk for you. Not that you're going to have your mind changed about anything. I'm not going to attempt to do that. I just want to respectfully share with you where my mind is at and where the arguments are that the science side uses to help people understand this phenomenon that we call conspiracy theories. So let us clarify what I mean when I say conspiracy theory, because it does mean different things to different people, and I don't want to say the wrong thing because we're not communicating correctly. When I talk about a conspiracy theory, I'm specifically referring to the false conspiracy theories, not talking about Watergate or Julius Caesar or anything like that, anything that's a known or established criminal case or legal case. We're talking about the stories that people believe that are denied by this establishment or that are not yet proven or that there's no evidence in support of. We're talking about these fringe stories. I'm calling them false. Maybe they will turn out to be true, but I just want you to understand the language I'm using. False conspiracy theories are what we're talking about today. Now, I have a very specific definition for what I call a conspiracy theory. What counts as a conspiracy theory? For example, you can say something pretty vague, like the government is up to something shady and malevolent and evil. Well, that's probably true. It's probably true of every government that's ever existed to some degree, somewhere in the government. But what is it? If you don't have any specifics, you're not making a specific claim. So my rule number one is your conspiracy theory has to be specific enough to be falsifiable. If it's impossible for me to dig up a piece of evidence that disproves your conspiracy theory because it was too vague, then it doesn't count. Then you're just repeating general knowledge like, I believe some companies are corrupt. That's a fact. It's general knowledge. It's not a specific claim. Rule number two is it has to be known to the conspiracy theorist, or at least presented by the conspiracy theorist, before it becomes public information, before it is discovered by law enforcement, the media, etc. In other words, you have to discover Watergate before Woodward and Bernstein do. That's what makes it a conspiracy theory and not simply reading the newspaper about something that somebody else has already discovered. One of the questions I get asked most often is, what are some of the conspiracy theories that have been proven true? Well, I'm somewhat known in my field for making a controversial claim. I'm saying this for the record now, no conspiracy theory has ever been proven true. No conspiracy theory has ever been proven true. And that's if you take my criteria into account. We're talking about false conspiracy theories that have not yet been announced via the media or law enforcement talking about ones that are specific enough to be falsifiable, and we're talking about ones that have not yet been discovered by investigators. If you've got all of that, and it comes true exactly as you predicted, that would be a case of a conspiracy theory being proven true. I'm saying right now, that has never happened, nor do I expect it to. Basically, a conspiracy theory is a future prediction. You're predicting that in the future, some big elaborate scheme, exactly as you've outlined it, is going to be discovered and proven to be true. That kind of thing just doesn't tend to happen. One time I was on a national radio program and I made this claim. I was there actually to challenge the host who had a history of promoting conspiracy theories, and so we were kind of getting into it. And he was having some callers call up and say, well, what about this one? What about that one? So I said, okay, look, here's my email address, brian@skeptoid.com. If you believe you know an example of a conspiracy theory that was proven true, email it to me. I promise I will do a podcast episode about it. And so, be careful what you ask for. I probably got over 1,000 emails from people, many of them containing obscenities, but most of them were people honestly saying, okay, I think you've overlooked this one. Here's the Gulf of Tonkin. Here's the Tuskegee experiment. Whatever they are, I want to go through with you now these 5 most common conspiracy theories that conspiracy theorists use as examples of a conspiracy theory being proven true. Because if those can be proven true, then today's can be proven true. So let's go through them one by one. Number 1. This is the most common conspiracy theory that I was sent as an example of one that was proven true eventually. It was the Gulf of Tonkin. Now, the Gulf of Tonkin incident is what triggered the United States to get into the Vietnam War. What happened was that on August 2nd, 1964, there was a conflict between some American boats and some Vietnamese forces. There was damage on each side. There was a few casualties on the Vietnamese side. It was a legitimate conflict, but we were not yet at war. Many people in the U.S. government were looking for an excuse to get into a war, however. And so what happened 2 days later was a second attack. Now, we now know today, I'm going to give you a little bit of a spoiler, that this second attack probably did not exist. It probably didn't happen. Now, what happened was this ship, the USS Maddox, a destroyer, was having a naval gun battle with some other boats, some supposedly Vietnamese boats. At night, they were seen only on radar. The Americans were firing only at radar targets. At no time was there any indication that anyone was damaged. At no time was there any returned fire. In fact, the captain of the Maddox was on the radio calling back to the Pentagon saying, I don't think there's anyone out there. We're shooting at radar targets, and I'm pretty sure nobody's reported actually seeing anything. No one's shooting back. I don't think there's anything going on. Nevertheless, Congress used that attack on the Americans as the excuse to enter the Vietnam War. So, were the conspiracy theorists proven true? Was the government lying and covering up this fact that it never happened as an excuse to enter the war? No. The reason the conspiracy theorists can't have credit for this one is because as the captain was radioing, a Senator Wayne Morse, was holding public press conferences reporting what the captain was saying. In other words, the general public and the media knew from day one, from minute one, that this attack was not a real one, that it was not actually happening. Did the U.S. lie and cover it up and claim that it was a false flag attack? Yes, they did. Did it ever exist as a conspiracy theory? No, it was known to everyone from the moment that it happened. It simply is a fact that false flag attacks do happen sometimes. In fact, it's been a standard of warfare ever since the Romans and the Carthaginians did it. But no credit to the conspiracy theorists for this one. Okay, the second most common example of a conspiracy theory supposedly proven true was COINTELPRO. And this was kind of a blanket name for a whole series of programs that the FBI conducted throughout the 20th century, the first 2/3 of the 20th century, led by J. Edgar Hoover, of course. And what they did was they were being subversive against groups that Hoover felt was subversive. This was civil rights groups, any kind of a progressive movement. They would do all kinds of shady crap against them. False arrests, there was a case of beatings at least, all kinds of harassment. Now, this was revealed to the public in 1971. The way that it was revealed was pretty interesting. There was a group of Vietnam protesters. They called themselves the Citizens Commission to Investigate the FBI. And they were looking for information about that the government knows that that the Vietnam War was fraudulent, whatever they were looking for. And what they found, they broke into an FBI office in the middle of the night. They did a very well-executed raid. They took a box full of 1,000 documents and they simply handed it straight over to the newspapers, almost immediately, without even reading most of them. The newspapers said, holy crap, it was COINTELPRO. It was revealing everything that the FBI had been doing against all of these progressive and civil rights groups. So, wow, it was quite the bombshell. But here's the reason why it's not a conspiracy theory proven true. It fails both of my two rules. First of all, there was never a specific conspiracy theory made before this 1971 discovery. People always said, Hoover hates people of color and gay people or whoever. Well, no duh. That was the only thing about Hoover that everyone knew. That's not, revealing anything special. The other point was that it never existed as a conspiracy theory anyway. Nobody had any idea that these things were happening until the investigators did the legwork. Investigators in this case being these citizens and the newspapers who broke the story. So, no cookie for the conspiracy theorists on that one either. Conspiracy theory proven true number 3 was the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. James Earl Ray was the guy who history says killed King. However, in 1993, this guy named Lloyd Jowers has kind of appeared out of the woodwork and said, no, I did it. I was working for the government. The government employed me to kill Martin Luther King. And James Earl Ray was just some innocent scapegoat that they hired to pretend to kill him just to cover up their involvement in actually hiring me. This guy went on TV and he told all these crazy stories. He was probably not completely sane. Now, however, the King family had always believed that the government was somehow implicated in the death of Martin Luther King. So they met with Jowers and they agreed that they would sue Jowers for wrongful death for killing Martin Luther King, thus proving that the government was involved and that it wasn't James Earl Ray. Well, that's exactly what happened. They went to court. They agreed to do this together. The defendant was, of course, the U.S. government and Lloyd Jowers. Well, the government didn't show up. This was a case for $100. Nobody in the government was actually named in the lawsuit, so they just ignored the whole thing. They lost by default, by not showing up. Lloyd Jowers paid the $100 to the King family, and the King family and many other people have since used this as proof that Martin Luther King was killed by the government and not by James Earl Ray. So you can't really claim credit for this because every single investigation into the assassination has always found proof that James Earl Ray was the killer. No investigation has ever found proof that Lloyd Jowers or anyone else was the killer. This was just a silly courtroom technicality that really didn't mean anything. So again, conspiracy theorists, no credit on this one. Conspiracy theory number 4 was the Tuskegee syphilis experiments. Now, for a period of time, in fact, for 40 years, running through the middle of the 20th century, from 1932 to 1972, the U.S. government was running syphilis experiments on mostly the black population. There was a clinic in Tuskegee, Alabama, run by the U.S. Public Health Service. And contrary to rumors, they didn't actually give anyone syphilis, but a lot of people who had syphilis would come to this clinic for treatment. And the clinic they were trying to do valid science. The science they were doing was incredibly unethical by the standards of our day. It would even be illegal, but it wasn't back then. We're horrified by the ethics that they had. For example, they knew that syphilis was curable with a simple shot of penicillin, but they withheld that from many of the black patients because they were trying to study the progression of the disease. Valid science, but unacceptably unethical and totally uncool in every way. It was revealed in 1972 when one of the guys who worked for the program became a whistleblower, and he revealed the whole thing to Congress and everything. And that's when it became known what was going on. So this fails criteria number 2 in that it never existed as a conspiracy theory. Nobody ever wrote or predicted or guessed or made any kind of a prediction that this was happening until it was made public by a whistleblower. So the 5th and final conspiracy theory supposedly proven true that we're going to talk about was the infamous CIA drugs for guns deal. So in 1998, this reporter named Gary Webb published a book called Dark Alliance, in which he revealed this systematic, lengthy, and deep relationship between the CIA and drug dealers south of the border, going in so far as to say that the CIA purposefully got black people addicted to cocaine in order to generate more sales for the drug dealers, and the CIA would give them all kinds of guns and everything. So this was unfortunately a little bit true, but also exaggerated. And the reason that that's important was because when his book came out, he got criticism from everyone because he was wrong. He was largely right, but because he exaggerated and went too far, even the people who were on his side criticized him. He got so much guff for this book that it made his life so rough that he actually committed suicide. Now, the conspiracy theorists have always said, aha, he was murdered by the government. That proves everything he said was true. Well, first of all, the CIA, ever since there's been a CIA, has always done things like this. For example, during the Korean War, the CIA worked with Chinese warlords. They would allow them to ship drugs to the United States in exchange for information. Intelligence is what the CIA was all about. And if Chinese drug lords could give it to them, they would look the other way for their drug shipments. We did it again with Manuel Noriega in Panama. We allowed him to send drugs to the United States because he was giving us valuable information. The CIA was always trying to get rid of these communist governments that were popping up all over the place. Where Gary Webb went too far was in his assertions that the CIA was taking an active role in the sale of drugs, because no investigation has ever found anything that went that far. So, unfortunately, his claims were wrong. They may have been right to some very limited degree. It just doesn't make any sense. They were probably wrong. He killed himself. It was a very terrible situation, especially since he was a great investigative reporter, much credit due for what he did reveal. But the conspiracy theorists cannot claim that he proved anything that wasn't already generally known. One thing that all 5 of these cases illustrate is that you can't work backwards to prove your conspiracy theory. You can't start with the conclusion that the government is up to some evil, nefarious plot because you don't like them, and then work backwards to find bits and pieces that will support and build that narrative for you. No, when these cases were discovered, take the example of Woodward and Bernstein, the 2 reporters who investigated Watergate. They found little pieces at a time, and they built a narrative from the ground up, not knowing where it was going to lead. It did lead to the uncovering of one of the great conspiracies of our age. So if you have a belief that a conspiracy theory exists, and you haven't done that work, if you're trying to start backwards, you're probably wrong. That's just what the data shows. That's just what the history shows. Another really common question that people ask me is, what are the craziest conspiracy theories? Now, I mean, you could go on endlessly because every day it's something. So rather than try to answer that question directly by giving specific examples, again, I try to characterize what makes a conspiracy theory. I hate to use the word crazy, but that's the way they ask the question. And really, the way that I answer that is by something that's simply implausible. It cannot fit with the way the world works. And one example of when this happened was I was a guest on a TV show. I won't say what one. You may have seen it, but the host was trying to prove that there's an old legend, an urban legend of a video game in Portland, Oregon called Polybius. And the host was trying to prove that Polybius was a government experiment to drive kids insane or control their minds or whatever it was. And so he brought me on as to talk about MK Ultra. MK Ultra is the actual program, 20th century, where the CIA was doing a lot of experiment with LSD to see if mind control is something that could be achieved against Soviet spies or whatever. So his thesis was that these video game arcade consoles were set up in Portland arcades. Kids would play them, the government would watch the kids score or do whatever they were doing and learn something about mind control. And my answer was, no, that's not the way research works. MK Ultra, like nearly all of these programs that the CIA funds, is done by legitimate scientists at research institutions, usually universities. The CIA has some interim little company that they set up with an innocent-sounding name, and they would give a grant to some professor at the university to do research about whatever it was the CIA wanted to learn. Now, scientists know how to conduct research. You have to do it in a controlled setting. Doesn't mean it has to take place physically in a lab, but there has to be experimental controls in place. It has to be a well-designed study. Otherwise, you don't learn anything. Your data is garbage. Now, the CIA would, supposedly, we would think, would want to learn things. That's the reason they throw money at this. They're not just trying to randomly attack and assault little kids who go to video arcades. They wanted to learn something. So if this was going to be done, it would have been in a controlled environment in some control way. There would have been control groups. It would have produced good data. They probably would have found that mind control through arcade games doesn't work. So that's the only answer that I would give him. And he kept pressing and kept asking the question different ways and trying to get me to say something like, yes, scientists think it's possible that the Polybius video game was an effort by the CIA to control the minds of children. Clearly, I wasn't going to say that. They actually did a pretty fair job of editing me on the show, and I was pretty happy with that. They did a good job. One of my favorite tools for helping to decide what's plausible and what's implausible is Occam's razor. I want to show you a little clip from a video I made in 2017 called Principles of Curiosity, available online at principlesofcuriosity.com, and this kind of gives my take on Occam's razor. You may have heard of Occam's razor, named for the Franciscan philosopher William of Occam. It's a tool that can help us decide which of several possibilities is most likely true. It's been stated in a number of different ways, but the one I like best is, among competing hypotheses, the one with the fewest assumptions should be selected. An assumption refers to some condition that's required to make the hypothesis possible. If we see some strange light in the sky, one option is that it's an alien spaceship. For this to be possible, we'd first need to accept the assumption that alien spaceships visit us, a pretty big change from what we currently understand. The other option, that the light is simply something we don't personally recognize, requires no new assumptions about the world, and is therefore most likely correct. In short, Occam's razor tells us that ideas which work only if some magical new thing is added to the world are probably wrong. Here's an example of one conspiracy theory that's really big in pop culture right now, and that is completely implausible, and that's the whole QAnon conspiracy. This is the supposition that there is some mysterious individual embedded within the Trump presidency who is somehow related to intelligence or State Department or something. And his name calls himself Q, and he is constantly posting little tidbits online, making predictions such as huge numbers of Democratic senators who are pedophiles are going to be indicted tomorrow. And at this time, he's been making these predictions for years and years and years, and so far, not one of his predictions has ever come true. Now I ask, how plausible is it that if this information was true, if the government actually was planning to do all of these things, how plausible is it that this guy would be allowed to freely post online about it all he wants? Not very plausible. That's a case where a simple application of Occam's razor could keep us from believing in something that's clearly not true. So besides just being implausible, at least one researcher has come up with a way that we can actually calculate a probability, a number, for any given conspiracy theory to help us tell whether it's likely true or not. So it happens to be a friend of mine, David Grimes, his 2016 paper titled On the Viability of Conspiratorial Beliefs. It's available online. You should check it out. So what he did was he took a bunch of historical conspiracies, actual conspiracies that were eventually discovered. Example, Watergate was one. And he looked at how many people knew about it, how long did it take before it was actually discovered, and a whole bunch of other factors. And by working these all together, he kind of came up with this set of equations that if you plug in these numbers, turns out that gives you how long it's going to be before it's discovered. Because obviously you can't silence everyone in the world forever. The more people who are in on something, the longer it takes, the more likely there's going to be a leak and it's going to become public knowledge. So, for example here, just a couple from his paper, using his equations, it would be possible to come up with for a 95% probability of it eventually being discovered. If NASA had hoaxed the moon landings, that would have taken only 3.68 years. Just too many people involved. There's just no way you can threaten or pay off tens of thousands of people for that long. Now, if climate change was actually a hoax conspired by all the world's climate scientists and climate students and everyone else, it would have taken 3.7 years before that was blown. And if all pharmaceutical companies were secretly suppressing the cure for all cancers, which is, again, a common conspiracy claim that I get all the time, they would have gotten away with that for only 3.17 years. You just can't keep that many people quiet for that long. Okay, so I'll give you one more tool that you can use to help determine whether a given conspiracy theory is likely true or not. This is just kind of a rubric to let you evaluate the quality of the evidence given to support something. And it's called FLICC, F-L-I-C-C. Now, if any of these 5 arguments are used to support the conspiracy theory, that gives you a pretty good idea that it's fake. F stands for fake experts. L is logical fallacies. I for impossible expectations. C for cherry picking. And C for conspiracy theories. How thematic for us today. So just to run through these, I picked an example here. Let's take the conspiracy theory that 5G cell phone service is a plan by world governments to control all of our brains. Yes, that's real. Okay, let's apply FLICC to it. F, fake experts. We see this all the time. Now, 5G is just a radio signal like any other radio signal. Nothing special about it. And yet there's a handful of anti-radio activists. There's like 3 or 4 of them who are always cited and always have been. They came out against Wi-Fi when it was introduced. They came out against cell phones in general when those first became a thing. And then each time we've had a new generation of cell phones, they've come out again. When we had smart meters installed so that utility companies could get more granular reporting from our energy usage, they have protested that because they transmit their data with radio. So you got these same 3 or 4 kind of the usual suspects who are always behind these articles presented by the press as experts when, of course, they're simply anti-radio activists. For logical fallacies, now logical fallacies, of course, that could be a whole talk on its own, but let's just pick one. Let's pick the slippery slope argument. How would that apply to this claim of 5G being used for mind control? Well, let's say that the argument is, if you let the government control your mind with this, you're going to let them have total control over everything. So that's a slippery slope argument. If you hear that used to support a conspiracy theory, then that gives you just one more hint that it's probably a false one. Impossible expectations. A classic one is that, well, of course it's true that nothing can be 100% safe. We can't build cars that are 100% safe. So is the use of a spectrum of the radio frequency, is that 100% safe? Well, I guess we can't say that it is. For example, 5G uses pretty much the same band that police and fire radio have used for decades. So we've got pretty much all of the history and all the science on the side to know that it's safe. But is it 100% safe? Well, probably not. I'm sure you could find a case where a radio fell on someone's head or some sort of radiation caused some, well, there you go. You can pick a different type of radiation and you can show how that can be harmful to people. So impossible expectations, if those are given, then it's another clue that the conspiracy theory is false. Cherry picking. Way back when cell phones started to become a thing, there was a case of a guy who had a brain tumor on the side of his head near his ear, on the inside of his skull, that was like just the shape of his cell phone. And to this day, that case gets trotted out as proof that cell phones cause brain cancer. Now, of course that's not true. It's cherry picking the data to find this one case where a guy happened to have a brain tumor in exactly the same place that where he held his cell phone. Never mind the vast majority of other brain tumors by other people who use cell phones that were not in that place. Cherry picking is another one to look out for. And just conspiracy theories in general. Good science is not presented with a conspiracy theory. If you open the pages of Science magazine or Nature magazine and it presents you some new genetic research, whatever it is, it's not going to be supported with a conspiratorial claim. It's going to be reported with data. Conspiracy theories are always a tip-off that the report is false. I would also like to talk about reasoning errors. This is sort of a formalized system for identifying 4 basic errors that we can make, either accidentally, or if you're really good at it, you can use them deliberately to make a point that might not otherwise be as persuasive. So these 4 basic types are the type 1, the false positive, the type 2, the false negative, type 3, answering the wrong question, and the dreaded type 4, asking the wrong question. To illustrate these, I want to use the example of prison camps. There is a subculture of people who believe that the U.S. is establishing prison camps in which millions of law-abiding U.S. citizens will be incarcerated for presumably orderly execution for some reason. The type 1 error is the false positive. This is where you make a conclusion that something is true when it in fact is not. So the obvious example here is that a person drives by, they see an empty train yard with a fence around it, and maybe some abandoned cars outside, and they conclude, well, the only possibility there is that this is a government prison camp waiting to incarcerate millions of law-abiding citizens. The type 2 error is just the opposite. Let's say the government actually is planning to do those things, and I drive by the same train yard and I say, looks like an abandoned train yard to me, nothing to see here, folks. Well, I've just made a type 2 error, a false negative, because I've come to the wrong conclusion. So the type 3 error, answering the wrong question, is where this starts to get more interesting. So when a conspiracy theorist publishes a list on the internet of all of these locations that they've identified as prison camps, they are answering the wrong question. The right question to ask first was, do such camps exist at all? But instead they skipped over that question and they just went to the one that they'd rather answer. They're assuming the answer to the first question, and they're answering, okay, well, where are these camps that supposedly exist? Now, the type 4 error, asking the wrong question, this is probably the one that's most easily and effectively used on purpose. So we're not going to ask the question of, do such camps exist? Because that has an obvious answer that the conspiracy theorist doesn't like. Instead, the conspiracy theorist is going to ask all of these other questions to sort of suggest guilt by complicity. I've written down a list of a few of them here that I found. Are there examples of government corruption? Obviously, yes. Has the government imprisoned people in the past? Obviously, yes. Are there laws that permit the government broader powers during times of emergencies? Obviously, yes. Are there plots of land for which there is no obvious purpose? Obviously, yes. Now you put all those things together and it seems, wow, we must draw the conclusion that the government is preparing all these prison camps. So by asking the wrong question, you're diverting attention away from the big question and kind of suggesting and building a whole case around your preferred worldview. I want to say a little bit about the term the official story. The easiest way to discredit something is to dismiss it as being the official story, as if being the official story is all it takes to be automatically false without having to prove anything. It's almost like a swear word, dismissing an idea as the official story. It's actually used as what we call a weasel word. A weasel word kind of suggests something just by applying that label to it, it's automatically true. Now, in 2012, there was an article called Dead and Alive, Belief in Contradictory Conspiracy Theories. This article took a look at the idea that the people who tend to dismiss the official story will embrace anything that is not the official story, because that by itself is good enough to serve as evidence that it's probably true. And by contradictory conspiracy theories, in the title of the article, what they were talking about was people who actually believe two different things at the same time. One example that they gave was the theory of Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden had been killed in a raid by a U.S. SEAL team, but some people believe that he had actually been killed much earlier, and they also believed that he was still alive. They believed two completely irreconcilable versions of the story simply because they both contradicted the official story. As long as it's not the official story, that's good enough. It's probably true, even if they're mutually exclusive. Another really familiar example of this was some people who believe that the Kennedy assassination was anything except Lee Harvey Oswald. Whatever it is, that's fine, as long as it wasn't Lee Harvey Oswald. For example, there are people who believe Kennedy had been killed much earlier and that he is still alive somewhere. They believe both of these things, even though they're mutually exclusive. 9/11, the Twin Towers. Remember the planes that hit the Twin Towers? Two airliners, right? Well, there are plenty of contradictory opinions for what those were. They were not actually planes, they were holograms. They were missiles. They were military planes painted to look like commercial airlines. They were hallucinograms. Let's pretend that's a word. Anything that's not an airline, because as long as it wasn't a commercial airline, that's good enough. It's probably true. So people will happily embrace any of those stories, even though for any of those individually to be true, there would have to be a completely different backstory and a historical structure behind what caused each of those to be the thing that brought down the Twin Towers. But because they're not the official story, that's good enough. So if we're talking about intelligent people in the world believing things that are clearly implausible, does that mean that they have to be crazy? They've got to be nuts. There has to be something wrong with them. Well, it's a valid question to ask. The answer, in my mind, is a firm no, but we're going to get to that in a moment. First, we're going to find out why. And to do this, we turn to the handy-dandy DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. We're going to turn to the section on delusional disorders. Here it is, page 90. So there are 5 basic types of delusional disorders. This is something where a duration is 1 month or longer, and it's got some other features, and then you can get a clinical diagnosis of delusional disorder. The 5 types. Number 1 is the erotomanic type. These are the people who believe that some movie star is in love with them, something like that. Occasionally you'll find some crazy guy is caught climbing through the bushes trying to get into Britney Spears' house, whatever it is. That's the erotomanic delusional disorder. Second type is the grandiose type. These people email me quite frequently, actually. Grandiose means that they've got some superior knowledge. They've made some important discovery. They're so much more smarter than everyone else. The typical email that I get is that they've come up with a whole new model of the universe that proves Einstein wrong. Why do they mention Einstein? Because he's the only scientist whose name they know. Third type is the jealous type. And this is where someone believes, it's usually that they believe their spouse is cheating on them to the point that it just becomes out of control and you can no longer go through your daily life. Next type is the persecutory type. And this is the kind that we're most interested in today, that has the most features common to, sort of the stereotypical conspiracy theorist. The central theme of the delusion involves the individual's belief that he or she is being conspired against, cheated, spied on, followed, poisoned, drugged, maliciously maligned, harassed, or obstructed in the pursuit of their long-term goals. So, this is the people who think that 5G cell towers are poisoning them, that airplanes are spraying chemtrails, that government is doing something actively against them. That's the persecutory delusional disorder. And then finally, the last type is the somatic type, and this has to do with strange sensations. You feel things happening on your body that aren't actually happening. And then there's mixed and unspecified. But anyway, the question is does this explain conspiratorial beliefs? And I said a moment ago, no, it does not. And here's one reason. We're going to skip to the next page on prevalence. How many people out there suffer from delusional disorder? First, let me ask you, how many people do you know have some kind of conspiratorial beliefs? I would argue that almost everyone, because there's a lot of fairly mild ones. Big Pharma isn't always honest with their testing, okay? A lot of people have some sort of conspiratorial beliefs, many of them more profound than that. How many of them actually have a diagnosable psychological disorder? 0.2%. That means that almost all the conspiracy theorists out there that you know, that you've spoken to, that you hear of online, do not have a clinical diagnosis. They are not crazy, and use of that term is only going to do us more harm than good. Remember how I said at the top of this video that we're all conspiracy theorists? Well, we're all at least a little bit delusional in some ways. We all have delusions throughout the day. For example, you go walking into a room and you've got a pimple right on the tip of your nose. What are you going to think? You're thinking everyone in this room is staring at my nose, when in fact, probably nobody notices it, nobody cares if they do. And there's that old philosophical statement, question everything. You should always question everything. That's how we learn what's right and what's wrong, right? Nothing is above being questioned. Nothing is so holy or scripturous that it can't be questioned by us lowly people, right? Now, that's true, but it's true from a philosophical standpoint. It's not true from a practical standpoint. You have to get through your day. You can't stop and question everything. If you're walking down the sidewalk, you can't wonder if each new square of cement is a hologram that you might fall through. Okay, that's an example of where you got to draw the line somewhere. What's worth questioning and what's not. Philosophically, there's like 4 reasons why we want to question everything. We want to make good life decisions, so we want to base those decisions on good information. Questioning things scrutinizes them, helps us improve the quality of that information, that lets us make better life decisions based on it. Second, the world is full of fabrications, lies, bad information, people and parties who are actively seeking to deceive and defraud us. Putting the information that we receive through the filter of inquiry and verification, that's a way to weed out that bad information. Then you have policies and opinions and doctrines like authority, government, education, foreign policy, religion, capitalism, conservatism, liberalism. These are all matters of opinion. They must always be open to question and exploration. People hold these things with great passion and in very high regard, and yet you have to be able to question them, even your own. And finally, maintaining an open mind, questioning your assumptions, is the key to maintaining an open mind. We all believe things that are wrong, that's just a fact. Questioning the things that we take for granted, that's how we avoid the arrogance of certainty. The arrogance of certainty and its inevitable folly. However, this is all fine from a philosophical perspective. From a practical perspective, not too much. I have 3 basic rules that I follow for deciding what I'm not going to question. And the first one, is it ridiculous? If there's a ridiculous idea, I'm not going to waste my time on it. I've got a limited number of hours in the day. I'm not going to worry that you might be an alien from planet Zero simply because you claim it. Move on. Get on with your day. Next, is it axiomatic? Okay, 2 plus 2 equals 4. That's an axiom. Do not question it. You can, but you're wasting your time. 2 plus 2 doesn't equal 5, no matter how much you think it's philosophically worth questioning it. If you want to get through your day, pass on things that are axiomatic. And then finally, has it already been questioned to death? If it has been questioned to death, you're probably not going to find out anything new. The Kennedy assassination has been questioned to death. You're not going to find out anything new no matter how much time you spend researching it or watching YouTube videos. It's simply not worth your time. It's worthy of being questioned, absolutely. But so many people have done it so much that the chances of you coming up with something new, realistically, for all practical purposes, it's a waste of your time. Move on, get on with your day. Do not question everything. So this all funnels down to the million-dollar question here. If conspiracy theorists aren't crazy, and they're not, why do people believe things that are so easy to disprove, things that are implausible, things that are impossible, things that evidence shows are not the case? How can smart people who go through their daily life, who have families, they have jobs, they're intelligent conversationalists, and yet they have these beliefs that are so far out there? How can this be the case? Why do people believe? Well, of course, this is the question that we all ask ourselves all the time, and there are many, many answers for it. Some might say that there are as many reasons for this as there are conspiracy theorists multiplied by the number of conspiracy theories. One reason, and this is the simplest and most basic reason, is that a conspiracy theory is easy to understand. A question like geopolitics is a big question. It's a complicated question. Nobody on the planet can understand it. But if you simply say, well, there's a global cabal of Illuminati behind the scenes to whom all world governments have willingly turned over their sovereignty, well, that makes sense. That's simple. It's easy to wrap your arms around. Conspiracy theories are intellectually attractive because they're easy. Another reason people believe them is because they confirm your preferred worldview. Now, we already know that conspiracy ideation, the tendency for people to embrace conspiracy theories, cuts evenly across all demographics. There is no group that is immune from it. We all like to say, my political party doesn't believe any conspiracy theories, but theirs does. Well, we know that that's not true. My favorite example of this is you can take a far-right conspiracy theory that says George Soros is behind all the world's evils, backspace over George Soros and type in the Koch brothers, and now you've just converted it to a far-left conspiracy theory. And you can do the same thing by saying the 1% are behind all the world's problems, backspace over the 1%, type in the Jews, and you've just converted it back from a far-left to a far-right conspiracy theory. They're all over the place. Poor people, rich people, educated people, uneducated people, people from this country, people from that country, they're all conspiracy theorists to about the same degree. All of these groups have worldviews. No matter what political party you're with, you've got certain ideas that you're going to tend more to embrace than others. The opposite people, your opposite counterparts, are going to dismiss your conspiracy theory as laughable, and they're going to have one of their own that you think is laughable. They're everywhere, and there is a conspiracy theory for everyone, for every worldview, for every group, for every demographic. We are all conspiracy theorists. Why would this be? Wouldn't you think evolution would come up with something a little bit better than that, than to make us all conspiracy theorists? And this idea that it's simply an evolved trait, I think, is really the underlying foundation of the whole idea of conspiracy ideation. You've probably heard this before, but the basic example, the most common example, is the proto-humans running across the savannah. And occasionally, the grass rustles. Some of them think, oh, it must be a saber-toothed cat, I better go climb a tree. And others say, it's nothing, don't worry about it. And occasionally, that person does get eaten by a saber-toothed cat. A little bit of native paranoia was an important survival tool. And so it became ingrained in our genes, because over generation and generation and generation, those who were just a little bit more paranoid tended to survive just a little bit more often and pass on the paranoid gene to their offspring. You ever go out into the woods and you run into a deer and see how easily they spook, or a rabbit or anything like that? Wild animals, they exhibit this pretty dramatically. They are hardwired to be very worried about anything and everything that they see, because most of the time it's a predator for them. So if that was the extent of the explanation, then you would think that we would all be just totally over the top in our conspiracy beliefs. But many of us are not. Many of us are fairly well grounded. Well, why is that? How does evolution explain that? Well, that's not necessarily part of the nature of the equation. That's part of the nurture of the equation. And what I mean by that is we all have life experiences. We all have friends. We all went to school somewhere. We all live in some state. We all have a culture around us, a society around us. We all watch certain movies or read certain books. We all have a wealth of information about the world, but coming from all sorts of different sources. My next door neighbor, who probably watches different series on television and reads different books than me, he probably has a different worldview than me that's been fed largely by that influx of different types of information. Now, this information that we have is what our brain uses to filter our native impulses. If our native impulse is to suspect a malevolent conspiracy theory behind every random event on the TV news, then our intellect is what uses our experiences to filter that native impulse. Our intellect can say, okay, yeah, I'm probably pretty worried that that train going by carrying tanks and jeeps means martial law is about to be imposed tomorrow, but my intellect tells me that that's probably not the case. So I can say, oh, okay, it's probably just the Army moving things around the way they do because they're the Army or the National Guard, whatever it is. So we can filter our native impulses and learn to be less conspiratorial. And this can also explain why we're all conspiratorial to a different degree, because some of us have different experiences. Some of us may have experiences that have, by chance, happened to confirm something conspiratorial, and so we tend to be more into that. But it's left everyone on the spectrum, and by spectrum I don't mean one axis. I mean, think of an audio mixing board that has a million little sliders. They're all over the place. Everyone is going to be very unique because we're all products of the information and our experiences. I want to give you just one little kind of fun, goofy exercise that illustrates how we have such different experiences. Even people who live the same life can have different perceptions of exactly the same thing. How many times have you seen the full moon up in the sky? I mean, seriously, how many times? 1,000? It's probably a pretty big number. You're very familiar with what the full moon looks like. And yet, I'm going to show you right now that you have no idea about a very basic metric, which is how big is it? So imagine looking at the full moon in the sky and holding up your hand at arm's length and separating your fingers to be just the size of the full moon. Now imagine you're holding some object out at arm's length. What object held out at arm's length is the size of the full moon? Here's 6 options. Is it a BB, a pea, a dime, a quarter, a golf ball, or a tennis ball? Now, most people have one answer for this, and I'm going to tell you which one that is. But I want you to consider which one of those objects, if you were to hold it out at arm's length, is about the same size as the full moon at night. You ready for the answer? Well, the answer most people give is a quarter. The correct answer is a pea. Quarter's about 4 times as big as a pea. If you were standing on the moon, the full Earth would look about the same size as a quarter if you were holding it out at arm's length. But a pea is the correct answer. Most of you got that wrong, and I know this because I do this in one of my live shows, and almost everyone in the audience guesses either the dime or the quarter, sometimes the golf ball. It's incredible how wrong we can be about something so obvious that you would think you would know everything about. Let me give you one more similar example. Draw 2 circles on a piece of paper like this. Pause the video if you need a minute to find a pencil and paper, or use your iPad, whatever you want to use. I'm going to take these 2 circles, and now I'm going to name something else that you've seen tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of times in your life, and I want you to draw it. Doesn't have to be a very good drawing. It can be just basic lines. Should take you about a half dozen lines to get the basic idea. I want you to start from these 2 circles and now draw the rest of the bicycle. How many bicycles have you seen? And yet you're going to find out that you don't have the faintest clue what one looks like. Almost nobody can draw something that looks remotely like a bicycle. Look at these examples. These are some other ones that people have done in my live show, and they gave me permission to show these, so I'm not deliberately making fun of anything. But would any of these work very well as a bicycle? I think not. The bottom line is, do not trust your perception. We could go through examples like this all day. And when we can all be so far along on the spectrum of how big the full moon is it a pea? Is it a golf ball? That's a great little kind of microcosm of how we can differently interpret the same event in the news. Some might look at, there was an invasion in Sicily. Some might say, oh, that confirms my conspiracy theory. Another person is going to say, oh, that disproves my conspiracy theory. We're all products of our native impulses filtered by our experiences. In that sense, in a very real sense, to some degree or another, we are all conspiracy theorists. Making these associations is not a flaw. It's not an error in thought. It doesn't prove that we're stupid or crazy. It is our brain doing exactly what it is intended to do. Sometimes the brain is coming to the wrong conclusion, but nevertheless it's following the right process. It's doing the best job it can to process most information as well as it can, given the limited resources that one person's brain has. So I promised I'd come back to Timothy McVeigh. So he was, of course, convicted and found guilty of all of those murders, plus a whole other set of both federal and state crimes. He was executed on June 11th, 2001, 3 months to the day before 9/11. Now, some people, believe it or not, some people have taken 3 months, 6/11, taken the 11th month of 2001, added those up to get a 3, times 3, and you get 9 to make it 9/11. I don't pretend to be repeating this accurately, but suffice it to say that there's a sufficient amount of numerology around the date of the execution of Timothy McVeigh, which somehow proves that the government was actually complicit in 9/11, made it happen. It was an inside job, and they decided to announce it through this strange cryptic numerology scheme of the date of Timothy McVeigh's execution. There's an interesting level of cognitive dissonance going on there for the people who believe this. Anyway, this is the conclusion of my talk on We Are All Conspiracy Theorists. I hope you're not as far down the spectrum as Timothy McVeigh is, or the people who do numerology on the date of his execution. My name's Brian Dunning. Thank you very much.